Welcome to another Big Train Tour at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today, we'll be taking a look at a lowly boxcar built in the late 19th century. This simple, outwardly unassuming car is one of the museum's unexpected gems when it comes to showcasing one of this state's more colorful railroads. After many years of service as crew quarters, this unlikely survivor has been restored to its early appearance and is today proudly displayed in Golden. Hi, I'm Paul Hammond, Executive Director of the Colorado Railroad Museum. Our subject this week is a wood-bodied, narrow-gauge railroad boxcar. Like many rail vehicles, and especially narrow-gauge ones, the car served several owners and sported at least 3 different numbers during its service life. Colorado and Northwestern Boxcar 1026 today serves as a connection to a small railroad that once headed west from Boulder and up into the Rockies, and this region's storied past here in the Centennial State. The Colorado Rockies, just to the west of Boulder, are particularly steep and rugged. In the late 1850s, pioneering prospectors began searching the area looking for gold. Over the next 25 years, a number of hopeful strikes were made. Eventually, not just gold and silver, but also an element known as tellurium, which was naturally alloyed with gold, plus tungsten were all found in the area. Boulder itself was started in 1859 with the chartering of the Boulder City-Town Company. Roads were soon built connecting the town with mining camps located in the remote mountain valleys. The rugged canyons and steep terrain made this especially challenging, but starting in the early 1860s, an important transportation link would also be forged between Boulder and the Central City Mining District. By 1873, 2 standard gauge railroads were completed to Boulder, linking the town with Denver and the rest of the U.S. Boulder showed promise as a mining center, with abundant coal deposits nearby, ready to fuel smelters to process the ore. Now all that was needed was for a railroad to reach up into the mountains from Boulder. Construction began in 1881 on a grandly named line, the Greeley, Salt Lake, and Pacific. This Union Pacific subsidiary had transcontinental ambitions of crossing the Continental Divide and continuing on across the West. But it began by building a narrow gauge line up Boulder Canyon. About 3 miles from Boulder, the line then headed up 4 Mile Creek, climbing ever higher until it reached the mouth of Pennsylvania Gulch, which was later known as the community of Sunset, in 1884. This unique little railroad had steep grades, with the most difficult about 4.5%. The route included 66 bridges and trestles along the 14.5 miles between Boulder and Sunset. The line utilized borrowed narrow-gauge locomotives and cars from the Union Pacific-controlled Colorado Central and South Park lines, making it especially picturesque given the variety of railroad names and road numbers that could be found in operation. Over the next 10 years, the railroad would stay busy hauling people, ore, and goods between its 2 terminals. The twisting route was especially picturesque in the lower reaches of Boulder Canyon. But then disaster struck. 60 inches of continuous rain fell at the end of May 1894, causing a great flood that wreaked havoc on the entire region and especially Boulder Canyon. The damage was so great that operations ended immediately with no plans to rebuild. The panic of 1893 hit Boulder hard, with nearby mines laying off workers and in some cases shutting down altogether. The loss of the railroad made the situation even worse. But within just 3 years, a new company had been formed to build a more expansive railroad network into the mountains above Boulder. Known as the Colorado and Northwestern, the line was soon being promoted as a means of more than doubling the output of the Ward mining district. In August 1897, the Denver Daily News ran a story that extolled the promise of the planned railroad. It also mentioned that locomotives and passenger cars had been ordered, along with 150 freight cars, a number that seems somewhat boastful based on the available evidence. Our subject boxcar was one of a group of 30 identical cars ordered from the Barney and Smith Car Company located in Dayton, Ohio. Delivered in 1897 and numbered 1026, this boxcar and its 29 identical twins were rated for 20 tons of capacity. They appear to have been equipped with air brakes from the beginning. Their couplers, however, were of the Lincoln pin style, known for causing many injuries and deaths among brakemen who were charged with making up and breaking apart trains. Construction of the new railroad began in late 1897, and by February 1898, rails had reached Sunset, the former terminus of the now defunct Greeley, Salt Lake, and Pacific. Track laying continued northwest to Ward, where mining was also picking up. The Colorado and Northwestern yards in Boulder were being completed alongside Boulder Creek, east of the 4th Street Bridge at the same time. In addition, the railroad was working with the Union Pacific, Denver, and Gulf, soon to become the Colorado and Southern, to lay 3-rail trackage 4 miles to the east out of Boulder. The narrow gauge would share the standard gauge railroad's right-of-way for this short distance, allowing ore trains to move their cargoes directly to the Pennsylvania mill at Culbertson without need for transfer. Later that same year of 1898, the railroad began surveying a branch line that would run from Sunset east to Eldora. Construction would wait until 1901 to begin, with trains finally running all the way starting at the end of 1904. In the meantime, the little railroad had begun to market itself as the Switzerland Trail of America, in promotions aimed at tourism. It had also begun to experience financial troubles, as actual freight traffic, particularly the movement of ore, was not meeting expectations. In the midst of uncertainty, the little Colorado and Northwestern cut a deal with the Colorado and Southern Railroad to add a 3rd rail along its standard gauge tracks all the way from Boulder to Union Station in Denver. This would provide a route for through passenger excursions, as well as yet another way for carloads of ore to reach a competing smelter in Globeville, just north of Denver. The railroad even had a new source of revenue during winter months: ice. In this time before mechanical refrigeration, frozen mountain lakes would have their surface ice sawed into blocks by hand. Then the blocks would be loaded into boxcars packed with sawdust for insulation. The blocks would then be transferred into other freight cars for further shipment or loaded directly into a cold storage warehouse for later use. The railroad boxcar was one of the earliest types of conveyances devised for use by railroads. Dating from the 1830s, boxcars would be used for all sorts of cargoes, some of which might seem impractical today. Boxcars were used for shipping all manner of goods, including lumber, grain, and even automobiles starting in the early 20th century. Today, railroads use a much broader array of specialized cars for shipping cargoes. Boxcars in the late 19th century were built of wood. As such, they were unable to carry the kinds of loads that more modern steel-bodied cars could by the 1920s. On Colorado's earliest narrow-gauge railroads, the very first freight cars, including boxcars, were quite small. Over time, these grew from 5 and 10-ton capacity cars to cars that could regularly carry 20 tons and sometimes as much as 25 tons of cargo. Colorado's extensive network of narrow-gauge railroads once hosted a wide variety of boxcars and operators. In addition to the Denver and Rio Grande, the pioneering Colorado Central, the Denver South Park and Pacific, and its successors, including the Colorado and Southern, would all use boxcars, along with other operators like the Florence and Cripple Creek. These once ubiquitous cars thus are found in numerous historical images of Centennial State railroading. Because of the risks of mountain railroading, Colorado narrow-gauge railroads early on equipped their trains with Westinghouse straight-air brake systems. The one thing lacking was that with a straight-air system, as differentiated from an automatic air brake system, There were no fail-safes in case of a brake pipe leak or a break-in-two situation. Link and pin couplers were the norm, but by 1893, Congress had passed the Railway Safety Appliance Act, which would be enforced by the Interstate Commerce Commission. The act required every railroad engaging in interstate commerce to equip its locomotives and rolling stock with automatic air brakes and automatic couplers by 1900. The goal was to reduce the terrible injury and loss of life that was singularly attributed to railroad brakemen in the late 19th century. With automatic couplers, it was no longer necessary to step between cars and out of the engineer's view to perform coupling and uncoupling functions. By 1906, the Colorado and Northwestern had not adopted these couplers, as per the requirement. But interestingly, a federal judge ruled that the line was not engaged in interstate commerce and therefore was not subject to the law. Management decided to convert to the safer couplers soon thereafter anyway. It appears the railroad had adopted air brakes from its inception based on photographic evidence. Even though the Colorado and Northwestern, later the Denver, Boulder and Western, was known for its excellent maintenance practices, boxcars like number 1026 lived a hard life. Out of the original 30 that were purchased, 7 had disappeared from the roster by the time the railroad closed down. This was likely due to wrecks and other misfortunes. The year 1907 would be a challenging one for the little railroad. Not only was a financial panic underway nationally, but the line's primary shareholder died suddenly, sending the Colorado and Northwestern into receivership. The railroad struggled through 1908, and by 1909 it was sold at auction to the highest bidder, which happened to be a collection of existing bondholders. The line was soon reincorporated with a new name, the Denver, Boulder, and Western. Prosperity quickly returned, with work on the new Barker Dam east of Nederland requiring trainloads of concrete and other supplies. A new precious mineral, tungsten, had been discovered earlier, but was coming into new commercial uses in the manufacture of steel and, of course, electric light bulbs. Tungsten ore reduction began at the Boulder County mine in Cardinal, just north of Eldora and east of present-day Nederland. The very next year, 1910, the Barker Dam project was completed and construction wrapped up on the related Boulder Canyon Powerhouse, which would generate electricity to power Boulder and the surrounding communities. Our boxcar, number 1026, remained busy through all of these changes. It's not clear that it was ever repainted with the railroad's new name, however. In 1911, the Denver, Boulder, and Western handled one of its largest passenger excursions ever, running 18 trains to Barker Lake in a single day to carry delegates of the Denver Grocerymen's Association. However, the railroad was also facing new competition in the form of automobiles, threatening its passenger traffic in the long run. Mining outputs would rise and fall in the teens, with corresponding amounts of freight traffic being carried. The railroad, which was subject to deep winter snows and occasional closure throughout its history, faced one of its very worst winters in 1913-1914. Shut down for 4 months, it finally reopened in time to host a busy summer tourist season. As the decade of the teens continued, war in Europe changed the line's fortunes once again. Suddenly, the price of tungsten rose significantly, and soon 80% of all U.S. production was coming from Boulder County. The railroad once again boomed, with shippers demanding better service and new line extensions being requested. Then another whiplash of market pricing occurred, and the price of tungsten dropped. The end of World War I in 1918 assured that mining would not return to its previous prominence. The final straw was a summertime flood event the very next year, which destroyed tracks and bridges in 4 Mile Canyon. The Switzerland Trail would never again see another train. The Denver, Boulder, and Western's owners were already in the midst of abandonment proceedings when the final flooding event occurred. To hasten the railroad's demise and avoid the potential of a ruling requiring it to rebuild, the entire railroad, track, buildings, locomotives, and cars, was sold to Morse Brothers Machinery and Supply Company of Denver. Soon, the railroad was being dismantled, and locomotives and cars sold off to new owners. One of these new owners was Western Union, the company which operated telegraph lines all across the U.S., utilizing railroads as their rights-of-way. Western Union purchased 3 former Denver, Boulder, and Western boxcars from Morse Brothers, including number 1026, along with 1 flat car and 3 passenger cars. The telegraph company was assembling a wire maintenance train, which it planned to use along the tracks of the narrow-gauge Denver and Rio Grande Western and Colorado and Southern railroads. The company employed similar trains and cars elsewhere in the U.S. Boxcar 1026 was renumbered to Western Union number 302, and it became the train's commissary car, more or less its dining car, and likely with room set aside to store supplies. Widening of its side doors, plus interior modifications to store and serve food, appear to have been the major modifications. It served alongside kitchen car number 301, converted from yet another former Boulder boxcar. Unfortunately, no pictures appear to survive of these cars or this service. We can only imagine the locations and crews that were a part of the train's nearly 15 years of service, repairing and restringing cable and telegraph lines right here in Colorado. In 1933, Western Union decided it no longer needed the green and gold train set, so it transferred, likely meaning gave, the cars to the Denver and Rio Grande Western. Western Union kitchen car number 301 became Rio Grande number 04800, remaining in service through the 1960s. Our subject car, Western Union commissary car 302, became Denver and Rio Grande Western outfit car 04801. It was more or less permanently assigned to Monarch, Colorado, where it served train crews working the rugged Monarch branch, which featured steep grades and switchbacks. Following the Monarch branch's conversion to standard gauge in the late 1950s, the car became surplus to the Rio Grande's remaining narrow gauge lines. It looked like this would be the end for this colorful car with a long service history. In 1966, the little boxcar that had begun life on the Switzerland Trail was brought to the Colorado Railroad Museum in Golden. Founder Bob Richardson had kept his eye on former Colorado and Northwestern Car 1026 for some time, knowing of its early history, and he arranged for the car's purchase and transportation. In Golden, the car was spruced up a bit, but otherwise retained its appearance from its final years of commissary car service with Western Union and the Rio Grande. With gold lettering on a green background, this appearance was fairly elegant for a second-hand railroad boxcar. The car was displayed this way for over 2 decades at the museum. Then in the late 1980s, a project was undertaken to return boxcar number 1026 to its original Colorado and Northwestern appearance. To accomplish this, the side doors were reconfigured, windows removed from the car sides, and new wood siding applied along with fresh paint and lettering. Completed in 2000, the car ever since that time has represented the short-lived railroad that once operated out of Boulder. Displayed outdoors, of course, the car's bright painted colors eventually faded, and some wood replacement was needed. Several years after completion of the Colorado Railroad Museum's Roundhouse complex, number 1026 was brought inside and given yet another overhaul and a fresh coat of paint. It emerged in 2012 and has remained on display ever since. Thanks for joining me today. Colorado and Northwestern Railroad Boxcar 1026 is, well, just a boxcar in its surface. But the history that it represents provides another unique slice of Colorado's rich railroad heritage. Built to haul cargo on a relatively short, steep, and twisting railroad, its original owners drew tourists to Boulder and thrilled them with views of America's Alps in the process. It then went on to support railroaders in a home-away-from-home setting for a second career with Western Union, and then a third with the Denver and Rio Grande Western. This car's 50-plus year service career was a long one, although certainly not unusual for Colorado railroads. In the process, this 1897 veteran roamed all over the narrow gauge rails of the state and helped to build the Colorado that we all appreciate and love today. I hope you've enjoyed our tour of Boxcar number 1026 and its travels through history. I also hope that your appreciation for Colorado's rich railroad heritage continues to grow with each and every tour of the museum's collections.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.